Well, hello and welcome everyone to this auDA webinar with an update from the recent forum organised by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN. I'm Michael Lewis, auDA's Industry Relations Manager. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm coming to you from today, the original home of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Please note this session is being recorded. In our last webinar, we were joined by Pablo Hinojosa from APNIC, who provided us with an overview of the global multi-stakeholder processes for internet governance. Today, we're going to dive a bit deeper into one aspect and one important aspect of that, and that's the process run by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN. And joining me, two of my colleagues, Bruce Tonkin, who is the Chief Operating Officer of auDA, who is responsible for the operation of the .au country code top-level domain. He has many decades of experience working in IT and internet governments, including 9 years on the board of ICANN. I'm also joined by auDA's Specialist Policy Advisor, Annaliese Williams, who is auDA's expert in internet governance and policy processes. She joined auDA in 2020 from the Australian Department of Communications, where she led the Internet Governance team. She was also Australia's representative in ICANN's ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee for 6 years, and has represented the Australian government at regional and global internet governance forums, the International Telecommunications Union, and other multilateral forums. Both Bruce and Annaliese have recently returned from the ICANN74 meeting in The Hague, and will share their experiences and insights with us during the discussion. And as always, we welcome your questions during today's session, and feel free to put them in the Zoom Q&A button down the bottom there, and we'll try and get to as many as we can throughout the conversation. Without further ado, let's get to it. So welcome, Bruce and Annaliese, and thank you for your time today. Annaliese, to kick things off, would you tell us about ICANN and why it's such an important organisation for auDA to be involved in?
Thanks, Mike. So ICANN, as we would have heard from the session with Pablo, internet governance and control of the management of the internet resources is not part of the UN system. Instead, it's governed via multi-stakeholder format, where all stakeholders come together to discuss and come to help inform decisions about the management of the internet. So it's an important organisation for auDA to be at. ICANN it coordinates the naming and numbering system globally for the global internet, and it's important for auDA to participate as the operator of Australia's DNS. Bruce, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Annaliese. I guess operationally, ICANN operates 3 registry databases, essentially. The first one is a registry of top-level domain names, and they are further segmented into what they refer to as generic top-level names, like .com or .sydney. And country code top-level names like .au for Australia or .nz for New Zealand. The thing that distinguishes between the top-level names like .com and the country ones like .au is that ICANN delegates the policy development for .au to auDA in Australia, whereas .com, the policies are actually developed by the multi-stakeholder community globally, and ICANN sets those policies for the world, essentially. The second main area of registries is the numbering registry. So that's effectively the equivalent of the telephone numbers in the internet. It's the physical IP addresses. And also ICANN delegates blocks of those addresses to regional parts of the world. So there's a block allocated to the Asia Pacific region, and that's managed by APNIC in Brisbane. There's another block for the Europeans, which is managed by RIPE, another block for the Americans, which is managed by ARIN, etc. Then the third major type of registry they operate is essentially a registry of parameters that relate to internet software protocols. There's a whole raft of those. For example, I have a registry that contains the global registrars, and each global registrar is allocated a unique number. They operate other parameters like the internet time database, etc. So those are the sort of three main databases that ICANN operates for the world.
Thanks for that, Bruce. And ICANN has a number of committees, don't they, that help govern it? And
yeah, it's similar to the way auDA is structured. So auDA has a general advisory standing committee, a technical advisory standing committee, and an EDU sort of policy standing committee. The equivalent at ICANN is there is a at-large community, which is, if you like, civil society to provide advice to ICANN, predominantly related to a user perspective for domain names. That's roughly equivalent to our general advisory standing committee. And ICANN has a security and stability committee that roughly deals with internet security issues and roughly maps to our technical advisory steering committee. They have a couple of more specialised committees. So one relates to the operation of the top-level domain name system, which is the root server advisory committee, and one relates to they have a committee which is a committee of governments, which is called the Government Advisory Committee, of which the Australian government is a member.
Great, thanks for that. And
I'll just add to that, Mike. So with the different committees within ICANN, so auDA participates in the CCNSO, obviously, with which is the country codes name supporting organisation. And we participate alongside other country codes like .uk, .nz, other countries, and then ICANN's other committees. So I'll just distinguish between the two sorts of stakeholder groups at ICANN. We have supporting organisations and advisory committees. So some of the committees provide advice to ICANN's board, and some of them sort of have a policy development role. So the GNSO, which is the generic name supporting organisation, which is where the .coms and the registries and registrars all participate. They sort of have a policy development role, whereas the advisory committees, like the Government Advisory Committee, provides advice to ICANN's board. It doesn't sort of set the policies itself.
And so, Annaliese, who sits on these committees? Like, how is the representation made up?
Of all of the committees. So the Government Advisory Committee is open to all governments and intergovernmental organisations, and they can nominate somebody to participate. For the country code supporting organisation, you have to be a representative of a country code manager like auDA. So, all of auDA's staff can participate within the CCNSO. Bruce, you may have something to offer on how the SSAC and the other more technical committees and the GNSO are comprised.
Yeah, the GNSO, which is the policy-making body for domain names like .com or .sydney, that operates as a set of stakeholder groups, and the stakeholder groups that make up that organisation are the registrars, the registry operators, the intellectual property community, business community, and the non-commercial community. So each of those communities form their own working groups, and then those working groups, or stakeholder groups as they're called, will then put representatives on a particular policy topic. So policy topic might be changes to the WHOIS system. So each of those stakeholder groups will place somebody on a working group on that particular topic. And then there is a coordinating council of which each stakeholder group elects representatives to that council. So that's sort of how the GNSO works. So it's fairly parliamentary, I guess, in its operation. The technical advisory committees have their members appointed directly by the ICANN board, in a similar way to the way auDA's advisory committees are formed. And so at various stages, they'll call for people that might be interested in joining. Their CVs are reviewed, they get interviewed, If they're adding something new or have unique technical knowledge, then they get appointed to that advisory committee by the board.
Great. We've had a question coming from Keith Besgrove about the attendance at the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee. How big are the meetings? How many countries generally attend the meeting?
That's a good question. So it does sort of vary by meeting, but the numbers have significantly grown in recent years, I would say, and there's sort of well over 100 that would participate. It's probably get 80 to over 100 at each meeting. And in terms of the representatives, the GAC representatives themselves, for many years that was quite stable, but at the recent meeting in The Hague, the vast majority of government representatives hadn't been there the last time ICANN met in person in 2019. So the turnover of GAC representatives is now quite high. And a lot of GAC members are coming to these issues for the first time, but there is a lot of government engagement and intergovernmental organisation engagement. So WIPO participates, the Universal Postal Union also participates, the OECD sort of sends representatives off and on, depending on what issues are discussed more broadly across the community, but there is a lot of government engagement.
And in terms of the total number of people attending an ICANN meeting, so the last couple of years, the meetings have been entirely online. This was the first face-to-face meeting, as Annaliese mentioned, since 2019. So the total number of people that were participating in the meeting was around about 1,800, and about half of those were physically face-to-face in The Hague, and then the other half were participating online. So a fair bit of effort's put into making sure there's video and audio facilities available in each of the meeting rooms.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And as you just flagged, you've both recently returned from the meeting in The Hague. What were some of the, can you tell us a bit about the event itself and what were some of the key things discussed? Annaliese, did you want to kick off?
Yeah, okay. So, well, the key themes that were discussed at this meeting, so ICANN sort of, the work of ICANN continues between meetings, between the 3 annual sort of conferences that it holds. And so probably the key themes that were sort of universally of interest across the ICANN community and the different stakeholder groups would be domain abuse or DNS abuse, or DNS abuse mitigation, I should say, like how to mitigate phishing, farming, DNS abuse. A key interest for auDA is security issues, DNSSEC, and Bruce did a session on that. I'll leave him to discuss that one. And also internet governance is, it's really becoming more of an issue across the whole community, and we're now, ICANN's government engagement team now does updates of internet governance processes and forums that are happening outside of ICANN, and how those discussions there may impact on stakeholders at ICANN and in ICANN's sort of operations itself. Bruce, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, look, just diving into a couple of the topics. So one of the things that is an inherent nature of the internet is it's actually just a network of networks, and so it's very tightly connected. And while you might sort of think of crime happening on the internet as happening in a particular country, the nature of it is actually global. So the location of using an example in Australia, we might have a com.au domain name that's been registered by an Australian small business. That Australian small business has got a web developer to build their website some years ago. That website might be hosted in the US, may not even be hosted physically operating in Australia. And then at some stage that website has been compromised. So that means that the software has been infiltrated and some bad content's been put on that. The two main areas of bad content are what are referred to as phishing attacks, where it's an attempt to gain your username, password, and any other personal information about you. And then it can use that information to get into other services that you might use, like your banking services and things. So it's referred to as phishing. And the other main type of bad content is malware, which is software that has been written to be downloaded into your computer. That software might be trying to harvest information from your computer, like get a list of all your email contacts, for example, or it could be used to actually corrupt all the files on computer and then charge you a ransom to have those files decrypted again. So it's commonly referred to as ransomware. Now, the targets of the phishing, using Australian website as an example, might not even be Australians. So we've seen instances where it's someone has actually built within a small business website in Australia a replica of a bank in Spain, and they're targeting people in Spain to upload their credentials to that website and collect that information. So the reason I'm sort of laying that out is that the problem of DNS abuse is really a global problem. It's a matter of that the hosting companies, the registrars, the registries are all in general in a different country. And so it does require global coordination to tackle these problems. So DNS abuse is a topic that is a great focus for most registries and registrars, and also governments obviously are trying to make sure their citizens are protected in the use of the domain name system.
So Bruce, do different countries present on their take on DNS abuse? Do they give presentations? Is there a discussion?
Yes, that's right, Michael. Yeah, so it's one of those things that's different. Each of those different groups we've talked about, and Annaliese had mentioned, there's we'll typically have a session on DNS abuse. So the government advisory committee with the representatives from the governments might get some presentations from people on recent global initiatives to tackle DNS abuse. A couple of those initiatives, one of which I'm involved in, which is the Dns Abuse Institute, but that's actually developing software to allow people to report DNS abuse globally and make sure that those reports are sent to either the hosting company or the registrar. Then you'll find that each country code tends to have its own approaches to managing DNS abuse. And so those country code operators give presentations in the country code supporting organisation that Annaliese mentioned. So we heard a number of people from around the world presenting, what they're observing within their country and the different techniques they're using to stop that abuse.
Right, Annaliese, did you have anything further to add?
Not on domain abuse, Mike, so we can move on. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I guess just sort of touching on the types of forums. I mean, what is the actual for those who haven't been to an ICANN meeting? What does it actually look like? Is it your typical conference with just speakers and breakout groups? Like what does it like to be at ICANN?
It's quite different to a standard conference. I think it's more of a working meeting, and there are the people in their various constituent groups, and there are also cross-community or plenary sessions where everybody gets together to sort of discuss the one issue together. The meeting we've just come back from was a policy forum, what they call a policy forum, which is there's three types of meetings that ICANN has now. The first one is a community forum, and where work happens across the community, but also in the different community constituent groups. The policy forum is really sort of focused on discussing both within the constituent groups, but across the community, and solving some of the problems some of the policy problems. And then the third meeting of the year is the AGM. Bruce, did you want to talk more about how it differs from a normal conference?
Yeah, I think I've often sort of looked at it as though there's almost like three completely separate meetings going on in parallel. There is an activity which is multi-stakeholder policy development that tends to happen in the GNSO, where they're actually trying to develop a new policy to tackle an internet problem. Then there's another group of people that's much more like a traditional conference. So there's a series of presentations on best practices, which is the country code supporting organisation format. And then the third format really is groups that are sort of experts in a particular topic area trying to develop advice for the board. So the Security and Stability Committee would meet and have several meetings over the course of the week on a range of topics with the objective to produce advice for the board. So the day tends to get divided up into, I guess, 90-minute segments. And then at any particular 90-minute segment, you'd find there's probably up to 10 different groups meeting in that period. Generally you can go to any of those sessions. So you can either stay in one stream and say, all I want to do is look at matters that relate to country code organisations, or you can say, I'd like to get a broad perspective on a range of topics. And so you can basically go to any of those streams during the course of the week.
Great, thank you. Annaliese, do you have anything else to touch on with the different themes that were discussed at ICANN?
I think we've covered most of them, but just to flag, I guess, that the global geopolitics really is impacting on what used to be just quite limited technical discussions. And that's sort of reflected across it's not just the GAC that is discussing these issues now. It's sort of other constituent groups are sort of discussing how decisions made outside of ICANN are impacting on ICANN stakeholders and the operations of the DNS.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And Bruce, I guess a key part of forums like this is the opportunity to engage with colleagues in other organisations in similar roles. How important is that, the engagement with our fellow CCTLD operators and others in the internet governance space?
Yeah, I think, Michael, we're all basically trying to solve the same problems. And then I guess what differs is the approach to solving those problems. So if I take DNS abuse as the example, one approach is to put a lot of the effort up front to validate people before they're able to register a domain name. And at the extreme level, that could require company and corporation documents. It might require photo ID, driver's license, that sort of thing. So basically they're trying to stop bad actors getting into the system in the first place. The other approach is that you have a relatively light requirement to check credentials before a name is registered. So it's essentially the approach of .com, for example. But then it's about when something bad happens, the focus is on responding to that quickly. And so it's being able to detect DNS abuse and then shut it down as fast as you can. So I guess the two extremes is lots of upfront validation, and the other extreme is very fast takedown. And then the more in between situation, which is where most of us are, is that you try and do some upfront validation, which is what we focus on at .au. And then with respect to takedowns, you do some due diligence. So you try and perform a number of checks. You allow the registrant time to rectify the problem before you shut the domain name down. And so when presenting that, you'll get all of those different approaches presented, and then you get a lot of the corridor conversations, which is debating which is the best method. And then you can take the learnings that you think make the most sense and try it in Australia. So we try and learn from what others are doing, and then try the bits that we think might work in our environment and try that out. And then once we've tried it out and we have some measurement of that, then we would report back our experiences back to the people internationally and say, well, we tried that and that didn't work for us, or we tried that and it worked really well.
Annaliese, do you have anything to add on engagement with our colleagues?
No, I think Bruce has covered it nicely there. Thanks.
Well, we've had a question for you, Annaliese, from Sandra Davey, asking if you could elaborate on the geopolitics and some of the key issues that probably were discussed at ICANN. I'm sure will be discussed at ICANNs to come.
Thanks for the question, Sandra. Yes, so I guess it comes down to there are sort of philosophically opposing views about how the internet should be managed globally. There are some governments like Australia who support the multi-stakeholder approach, but many other governments sort of would prefer a model that gave governments much greater control over how the internet is managed. And those sorts of conversations have been going on for many years, but they are sort of now reaching, I think, stakeholders sort of outside of the little government groups that used to have those conversations, and the multi-stakeholder environment is now much more aware of those conversations, and it's not just control of the internet. There's lots of questions about what is appropriate government intervention in the internet, and what is how does a global network or how do operators or industry operators within a global network like the internet, how do they manage and adapt to national laws? So not just in Australia, but in other countries, they're applying national laws to a global network, which does present difficulties when we're trying to keep the network globally interoperable. Bruce, did you want to add anything on that global interoperability part?
Just that I think one of the benefits of if you think about the phone system or the domain name system, but the concept is that each phone number is globally unique, and so you're the only person with that phone number and it works anywhere in the world. The same applies to domain name, so we try and keep each domain name globally unique. You're the only person with that particular domain name, and wherever you go in the world you can use that domain name and it operates in the same way. Where the system would fail would be if each country decided to run their own domain name system. And so if I had, Bruce.com, and then someone else could have Bruce.com somewhere else in the world, and you get an entirely different result. So what we try and do at ICANN particularly is ensure that there's a single naming and a single numbering system, and it works wherever you are in the world.
And if I could just sort of go back to that, so like the internet and the DNS now is sort of, years ago when it was all begun, it was sort of much more, like a little technical kind of, it's grown from a technical project, I guess, to something that citizens across the world are now completely relying on to live their day-to-day lives. We use it for work, for connecting socially, for shopping online, for learning. It's fundamental to our lives. And so as it's got more important, it's thrown up more and more challenges, I guess, that governments are now trying to respond to. And I think it wasn't sort of built with all of these, wasn't built to address all of these challenges. It was that have arisen. So we're sort of trying now to sort of build the rules and build the processes around to address the challenges that the internet has presented, and that does sort of not every country and not every government wants to address the same challenges in the same way. So that, again, brings a different sort of set of conundrums that need to be worked through.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I guess that really highlights the importance of the multi-stakeholder model for countries like Australia, and the need to keep supporting that model. And on that, sort of what are the next steps for auDA and .au on multi-stakeholder engagement with both ICANN and generally, given all you've particularly touched on with the geopolitical concerns, what's next? I don't know who wants to kick off first, Annaliese or Bruce?
I'll go first and then Bruce can add to it. So, well, auDA is, we ourselves are part of a multi-stakeholder community here in Australia. We are sort of one voice among many other interested parties here in Australia. We will continue to engage with members on these issues and seek input from members, but we'll also engage with other stakeholders. I might put in a plug for NetThing, which is Australia's sort of national internet governance discussion forum. We're holding that in October this year to continue discussing some of these issues, some of the policy issues related to the internet. Bruce, did you want to talk more about next steps and engagement?
Yeah, look, I think if I talk about a couple of the policy topics that are likely to impact Australia as well. So if what's been going on with Whois as an example, globally, the battle is between making information available so that you know who has registered a domain name and that they can be held accountable for what they use the domain name for. And that is in contrast to people that are concerned about their privacy and they're concerned about registering, having their name, Bruce Tonkin as being the owner of a particular domain name and having that public. And it's sort of the balance between those things. And we're seeing in Australia, there's a lot of attention to, if you like, strengthening our Australian privacy laws. And Australia often takes into account what other countries have done. And in this case, Europe has done quite a lot in the area of privacy. But that also has implications for the sort of naming system that we can operate. And so we're trying to learn how that is evolving internationally and how it might evolve our own thinking in the provision of our Whois service. And likewise, DNS abuse, we are benchmarking ourselves internationally, and we're currently about 0.04% of domains in .au are subject to DNS abuse, which is well below the global average. But we're seeking to actually get that a factor of 10 lower than that. And so we're trying to learn how other countries are tackling that so that we can further improve our performance around DNS abuse.
And Bruce, just since you touched on the Whois discussion, which was there was certainly a lot of talk in the media about that in the lead up to ICANN.
Yes.
Can you touch briefly, given we've only got a few minutes left, just on if anything happened at the meeting and if any progress was made?
Yeah, look, I think the policy work that's been done on ICANN there is about having a way for to protect sort of private information from the general public. But allow that private information to be accessed by those that have a need to use it. So those that would include law enforcement, for example. And one of the challenges, of course, is law enforcement, given it's a global issue. If we were receiving a request in Australia, how would we receive a request if that came from law enforcement in a completely different country? We don't even know who are the relevant people in those countries and how do we validate them. So a first step that ICANN is trying to come up with is a system where it's a little bit like a clearinghouse, but that different enforcement bodies would register with ICANN and could submit a request. ICANN would distribute that request to the relevant registrar or registry, and then that relevant registrar or registry would make a local decision based on their local laws as to whether they can provide that information. So that's a piece of work that ICANN's working on. I think the progress on that front was that the current model was getting, it's too complicated and expensive to build. And so a lot of the discussions were at ICANN about a simplified version of that model that could be implemented cost effectively. And as that model evolves, then that is something that we might participate in as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Bringing us towards the end of the webinar, I guess I have to ask: would you both call ICANN74 a success? Annaliese, do you want to take a crack at that one?
I think from auDA's perspective, certainly it was a success. There's been significant changes within the organisation since the last time we all met in person. So for for some of the people that were on our auDA delegation, it was a matter of meeting people for the first time that they may have been working with, or just having meetings with online. So it was good to get there and establish those relationships, meet in person. People were, I think, very pleased to see us and very pleased to see us not only turn up to the meeting, but commit to taking on roles. For example, I've taken on a role on a CCNSO Internet Governance Liaison Committee, and Bruce is on a DNS Abuse steering group, I think it's called. So yes, I think it was a success. People are pleased to see us and pleased to work with us, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the, this is sort of the general topic really, it's very similar to the working from home versus coming into the office challenge that people are adjusting to these days. But, there's definitely benefits in working from home, but there's also benefits in working in the office and being able to communicate with each other and perhaps on more in-depth topics. And one of the challenges globally, of course, is people in different time zones. So the opportunity to have in-depth conversation with our colleagues in Europe, for example, is difficult when a time that might be good for me will be in the middle of the night for them, and they're not going to spend 2 or 3 hours with me. So one of the benefits of the ICANN meeting is we had quite in-depth meetings with a number of our colleagues, such that we'd spent half a day with registry operators in Europe, including the Europeans and the Dutch and the French. And we also had sort of side meetings with our colleagues from countries like Canada. And so that meant that there were in-depth conversations that we all found very useful and came up with useful ideas across the outer organisation.
Terrific, and we've got another meeting for ICANN coming up in September. And for those interested in getting involved, what would be your tips, Annaliese?
Well, ICANN meetings. So the next one will be held in KL. So they are open. You can register to attend, but you can also register to participate online if you are interested. You can register via ICANN's website, and you can follow ICANN on its social media, on Twitter and Facebook and wherever else it is to keep up to date. You can engage with auDA if you have particular views about what's happening. You can always let us know. We're open to to knowing what's happening across the community and what all stakeholders think about issues. Bruce, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how to approach ICANN. I think as a start, it's probably best to participate online just to get a sense of the topics and do a bit of reading in the particular areas. And then going to a face-to-face ICANN is a mix of probably organising in advance some face-to-face meetings with like-minded individuals, I guess. So if you think you're sharing particular views with other people from an online meeting, arrange to meet with them in person. And then once you've got a few people that you know and you can meet in person, they in turn will introduce you to others. And then you get advantage of the more ad hoc nature of several hundred like-minded people being in one location, and you rapidly learn a lot because you get to talk to a lot of people that can offer you suggestions or areas that you can work on.
And just like, if you haven't been to an ICANN before, ICANN in recent years has put quite a lot of work into developing resources for newcomers. So you can check out their website. There's some information that explains what ICANN is, how all the various different groups work, what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do. So there is quite a lot of material on their website for anyone who's not familiar with it.
Great, well, thank you for that. I think it's about time we bring things to a close, but thank you, Bruce and Annaliese, for joining us. There's certainly a lot happening in the international internet governance space at the moment, and the ICANN forum certainly sounds like an interesting and important one for auDA to attend, and I'm sure we all look forward to hearing updates from future forums that you both attend too. A reminder to those who want to stay updated on auDA activities, as well as briefings and updates such as this one, you should consider joining as a .au member. It's free to do and only takes a minute of your time via our website. We also have a couple of upcoming events to flag for our members in Melbourne. We have a networking event in the evening on 19th of July. And for those members in Sydney, but you're invited to attend the auDA Foundation 2022 grants launch on the 10th of August. And as Annaliese flagged, NetThing is running in October online from the 27th to the 28th of October. So if you want to join Australia's version of ICANN, tune in there. There are also details on auDA's website. For members elsewhere in the country, stay tuned for updates for events in your area as they are scheduled. We'll have more to say throughout the year. So please sign up and stay tuned. Until then, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again to Annaliese and Bruce.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mike.